Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's free seating for this last plenary session. There's been no identity theft here. The fact that you don't have your name cards in front of you shouldn't make you feel any less important or individualistic. We have seating for you all. There was a bit of a logistic challenge to make certain we will get all name boards back here, but the good news is, as you recall, that any of you seeking the floor need only put your name card in the microphone with the chip facing you and press the button, and your light will turn green, and everything will be fine. You'll still be able to talk to your neighbor and not be recorded or have anyone else hear it. I will be able to turn your mic red when I call on you, then it's live, and when you finish speaking, it'll be off again. So if you think you might want to ask a question or make a comment, you can already unclip your badge from your neck and put it in, press the green light, and you're on the list, and I'll be able to call on you. You've all had, I think, very invigorating sessions this morning on detailed elements of the Manama Dialogue agenda. We often conclude the Manama Dialogue with 2 or 3 more ministerial statements, but we felt this year, at the 10th anniversary, it was important to draw some of the intellectual threads together of not just this event, but also how the themes in the region have evolved in the 10 years since we began the Manama Dialogue. Not strictly compare 2004 to 2014, though that might be done in 1 or 2 cases, but analyze the evolution of some of the key issues we've been addressing. And it will help us when you join in the conversation afterwards to think afresh about the issues that we will want to put on the Manama Dialogue agenda in 2015, and how we will try to shape a debate that engages all the ministers of the region and outside powers on the subjects that really matter to the region, and in a way that takes into account the new trends that are just visible on the horizon but need proper elucidation. So this last session is also partly about building our program for next year. And as we at the IISS Middle East office do our analytical work and contact leaders in the region, January, February, March, April 2015, we'll want to interrogate them on the kinds of issues that are most important to the region, so that we have an agenda at the end of 2015 for the Manama Dialogue that really reflects the concerns of the region. And the 4 speakers we have today, I think, will be fantastic people to animate this discussion. I'll ask them to speak from the podium for 8 or 9 minutes or so in the order that they appear in the program. The first, and I'll just go through the 4 of them, Mark Fitzpatrick, who had a long career in the United States State Department with a lot of experience in the Asia-Pacific, but also hugely focused on the problem of non-proliferation, has been our Director of Non-Proliferation and Disarmament for many years at the IISS, and is unambiguously one of the top 3 or 4 experts in the world on the Iranian nuclear program, has helped edit a number of dossiers on the Iranian nuclear program and on also their ballistic missile program, understands both the technology and the politics of the issue in equal measure. And in a moment, I'll ask him to address us on how this issue of the Iranian nuclear program has evolved in the 10-year life cycle of this Manama Dialogue. Dr. Basma Kodmani is a great friend of mine of the IISS, is well known to you as one of the leading Arab analysts of governance in the Arab world, of politics in the Arab world. She played an important role for some time as a spokesperson for the Syrian opposition. Many of you will have seen her in that role, and she's had time to reflect on the practice of diplomacy in the Syrian and wider Levant context, and I'll invite her to say a few words also about how the situation in Syria has evolved and where to take it from here. David Richards, Lord Richards of Hesse-Monceau, is a former Chief of Defense Staff of the United Kingdom, has had, in the celebrated but accurate phrase, a long and distinguished career in the British military with campaigns in various parts of the world, including this part of the world. he's the author of a new book about this, which I recommend you all read. And he's thought deeply and properly strategically about the challenges of military intervention in all sorts of different contexts. And I'll invite him to say a few words about how military intervention has changed, as it were, since we started the Manama Dialogue in 2004, and as Western practice in this area has come up against different types of obstacles and potentially also now new opportunities. Jamal Khashoggi, also known each other for a long time, used to work in the embassy of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in London when Prince Turki Al Faisal was the ambassador there, now general manager of the Arab news channel based here in Bahrain, but an authoritative commentator from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on regional trends, and we'll invite him to speak about issues also of governance and politics in the region. So with that preface, could I invite Mark Fitzpatrick to kick it off?
Thank you, John. The subtext of my remarks might be le plus ça change, le plus c'est la même chose. When the IISS first convened a regional security dialogue in Manama 10 years ago, it was shortly after France, Germany, and the United Kingdom had signed an agreement in Paris in which Iran agreed to suspend all enrichment-related activities. This was 2 years after the Iranian nuclear crisis had first become public, and a year after the E3 had concluded a deal with Iran to suspend enrichment. That 2003 suspension agreement was ambiguous and fitful, with repeated ruptures and disagreements over what exactly was to be suspended. In the 2004 Paris Agreement, the Europeans sought to plug the loopholes. In the Paris Agreement, the parties also agreed to discuss long-term arrangements that would provide, quote, objective guarantees that Iran's nuclear program was exclusively for peaceful purposes. Working groups were established and extensive negotiations began. The Americans were not involved in the talks, which did not have their blessing, to say the least. The U.S. administration at the time thought diplomacy with Iran would be a waste of time. Better, the Bush team thought, to quickly bring on pressure through sanctions and to insist on dismantlement of all enrichment-related facilities. I recall at the time how difficult those European negotiations were described as being, and how clever and slippery the lead Iranian negotiator was said to be. From another perspective, masterful would be a better description. And he was a man with whom one could make a deal. His name was Hassan Rouhani. At the time, I assumed Rouhani had the blessing of the supreme leader. I recently learned from a BBC Persian analyst, however, that Rouhani's request to vet the 2003 deal with Supreme Leader Khamenei went unanswered. Rouhani was on his own. The aloof Supreme Leader would bear no blame if the agreement went sour, which it did. Back in 2004-2005, the working groups could not overcome the key area of disagreement. For the Europeans, the only acceptable objective guarantee was if Iran did not operate any facilities to enrich uranium or reprocess plutonium. Although Iran was willing to forego plutonium reprocessing, it could not give up what it described as its NPT right to the full fuel cycle. It would never give up enrichment, but it did agree on a temporary suspension as long as the talks ensued. Now, Rouhani was severely criticized by hardliners for agreeing to that suspension. In the words of critics, he gave away pearls in exchange for candies. Though the Europeans' agreement not to bring Iran's case to the Security Council, as Washington had insisted, was no mere candy bar. In response to his critics back then, Rouhani countered that he had actually outmaneuvered the West by suspending one aspect of the enrichment program that wasn't ready yet anyway, while continuing another aspect, work on uranium conversion at Esfahan, which was Iran's priority at the time. Rouhani's 2004 defense of his tactics might be called Exhibit A in the case that many Western critics brought against him when he emerged as the moderate, smiling president in 2013. back the clock again. When Mahmoud Ahmadinejad came to power in 2005, Rouhani was replaced, and the Iranian nuclear crisis steadily worsened. Ali Larijani, the new nuclear negotiator, proved to be even harder to deal with and even less able to extract a yes from the supreme leader. It got still much worse when Saeed Jalili replaced Larijani. Bored to tears by Jalili's endless pontification in the talks, Western negotiators yearned for the wily Rouhani. They now have him again, and thank goodness. Only now the situation is far advanced. In December 2004, Iran had 164 operational centrifuges and 0 stockpile of enriched uranium. Work on a second-generation centrifuge model had stopped, and construction had yet to begin on a planned heavy water reactor at Arak. Today, nearly 20,000 centrifuges have been installed, and Iran has a stockpile of low-enriched uranium that is enough for up to 6 bombs if further enriched. 1,000 of the centrifuges installed are the second-generation type, and the Arak reactor is most of the way to completion. On the positive side, progress on all of these aspects has been capped. As in 2003, Rouhani and his team 10 years later agreed to a suspension of sorts. Last year's interim deal, which was recently extended, is akin to a ceasefire in which Iran agreed to stop one aspect of the enrichment program, the production of near highly enriched uranium, and to cap the number of centrifuges in exchange for no new sanctions. As in 2003, however, last year's interim agreement had a loophole. It allowed research and development on more advanced centrifuges, and last month that loophole was partially plugged. Contrafactually, some observers wish that the West had agreed to Iran's proposals back then for a 3,000 machine pilot enrichment plant. It must be remembered, however, that that proposal, as fleshed out in spring 2005, sought growth to an industrial scale of 50,000 centrifuges to produce fuel for the Bushehr reactor, which was then still being built. Iran's nuclear plans haven't changed much over the years. Back in 2004, Iran had a plan for 8 reactors at 2 sites. Last month, Russia signed a memorandum to provide 8 reactors at 2 sites. Actually, that would make 9 altogether, counting the one at Bushehr, which is now operating. According to the latest deal, Russia will provide enriched uranium fuel for the lifetime of the reactors. Iran's agreement to this provision seems somewhat odd, considering that Iranian officials keep insisting that they cannot trust Russia to continue to provide fuel even for the first reactor. This lack of trust and not wanting to be beholden to foreign suppliers is ostensibly why Iran insists on making fuel for Bushehr 1. One reason a comprehensive agreement could not be reached by last month's deadline is that Iran was not willing to give up its quest for a large enrichment program. Now, were it up to them, I think that Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif would have been willing to accept limits to the program sufficient to satisfy the other side that all paths to a nuclear program would be blocked. But the Supreme Leader made his negotiator's job immensely more difficult in July when he insisted that Iran would need an industrial-scale enrichment program in the medium-term future. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Agency explained the day later that this meant being able to refuel Bushehr 1 when the current Russian contract runs out in 2021, a contract that Russia is intent on renewing, consistent with its agreement to fuel the reactor for its lifetime. Given Russia's refueling agreement, Iran has no practical need for an enrichment program this size. Why then the insistence on it? Pride in Iran's technological achievements has something to do with it. But if so, Iran is paying a huge cost, well over $100 billion in sanctions for such an intangible, $1 million in sanctions for such an intangible goal. I conclude that a major reason has to do with the other purpose for uranium enrichment, because of the option it provides for nuclear weapons. Iran has been pursuing a nuclear hedging strategy for well over a decade. The question for the next 7 months is whether Iran will be willing to put this hedging strategy on ice, and for how long. I believe that Rouhani still wants to make a deal. I don't believe the Supreme Leader is ready to say yes to the conditions that would be required. Maybe the best we can hope for is that when Rouhani calls him the next time with the details of a proposed deal, Khamenei again won't answer the phone. Meanwhile, Iran's neighbors should feel reassured that, as British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond said yesterday, that 6 powers stuck to principles in the negotiations. They were not so eager to make a deal that they were ready to settle for something short of the necessary outcome. Their goal remains to block all potential paths to a nuclear weapon, with sufficient confidence that any such effort would be discovered in time and defeated and therefore deterred. So if a deal is reached, and I hope this will be the outcome in the next 7 months, the Gulf Arab states and others who are concerned about Iran's capabilities and intentions should feel reassured that it will be a good deal, a deal that will enhance their security and contribute to regional security. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much, and I'm sure there'll be questions from the delegates about some of the technical aspects of the deal that might emerge, and it would be useful for you to provide the technical arguments as to why a deal structured in the way proposed should give the necessary reassurance. Basma Kurmani, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My thanks go to the IISS, John Chipman, and the team. والشكر لحكومة البحرين لاستضافتنا في هذا المؤتمر. I will speak in English and not take too much time to make maybe 3 or 4 messages. My first point, it would relate directly to the theme of this session, which is that what is over the last 10 years, the regional security changes. I guess what we are learning about our region is that this decade has proved that the issue of the governance of diverse societies is absolutely key to the security and stability of the region. And I say governance, and I insist on the word governance for 2 reasons. First, the institutions that regulate relations within a society are what determines relations among groups. And secondly, we have had governments that have dealt in a very irresponsible way, and sometimes in a criminal way, with the issue of diversity within society, and manipulated state institutions in that direction. This, I think, is the lesson that we need to learn, that the answer to these problems come from the state, from the governance, and that we should have perhaps defined good governance by taking this as a key criterion for defining it. It is bad governance of diversity that has sowed distrust, fragmented society, and led, in some cases, to mass killings and conflict. That is one major aspect of the last decade. One aspect that relates perhaps more directly to the post-Arab Spring and the Arab uprisings, and perhaps is affecting mostly Syria, Iraq, and Libya, although Iraq should not be in that category, is that over the last 4 years almost, there has been an important shift in how the region and the political movements that have mobilized over that period have changed. And that is that we definitely had Islamist groups on the rise in the beginning of the Arab Spring. That was the case in the Syrian context because of the fueling of the armed conflict by funding, basically financing of military groups with an Islamist bent. And that has brought into Syria a lot of the Islamist discourse and ideology that is not very often related to the reality of this country and its social fabric initially. But what has happened is that over that period, what occurred in Egypt was a turning point in the sense that we now have a message that the armies, military apparatus, and security apparatus are seen as the best to be able to prevent extremism, but that extends in many cases to defining any Islamist movement as extremist, which is not always helpful, but that basically it will be the military that can keep the status quo and keep countries together and keep the borders as they were. There is a lesson there. In a post-conflict context, there's definitely a need to rebuild the security apparatus because there is a physical danger for communities. And there is no way we can speak of a political solution, of capacity building of state institutions without beginning with, unfortunately, with the military apparatus. In the Syrian context, I think we are looking at exiting a dictatorship in a context of a war against terror. And in that context, we know we need the international community, but that the international community, whether at the regional level, but more importantly at the international level, looks at the region as having a number one issue to deal with, and that is the war on ISIS, the war on terror. There is here a very important dimension of this war in the context where it is growing at the moment, and I believe the war focused on Iraq at the moment is perhaps making the Syrian situation more complex rather than resolving it or even putting it on hold. The idea that we deal with Iraq first and Syria will come afterwards, there are good reasons to believe that the risk is very high that the consolidation of Daesh inside Syria is going to be stronger as a result of the war and the lack of a strategy for the Syrian theater of operation. Yes, it is one. What happens in Iraq has strong repercussions in Syria and vice versa, but the lack of a strategy, of a comprehensive strategy in Syria at the moment is definitely complicating the situation there in very alarming ways. I would like perhaps to focus specifically on this aspect. The fact that we do not have a strategy for Syria. Yesterday we heard from both the French Minister of Defense as well as the British Minister, Minister Hammond, that there is no transition in Syria with the presence of Bashar al-Assad. Now, this is a reassuring statement, but it is not very helpful because we do not see much of a strategy behind that. At the moment, Syria is definitely in need of fighting terrorism. And those groups on the ground that have been fighting the regime in their large majority understand that the threat of ISIS is one that is absolutely key and needs to be confronted. There is no understanding of the fact that these groups on the ground are perfectly willing to be involved in a war against ISIS. And many of these groups are even willing to give priority to fighting ISIS if they are reassured about the end game, if they are told there is a strategy that will build, that brings a suppression, elimination of ISIS, and then a solution to the threats and the crimes that are committed by the regime. That is one that dictates a comprehensive strategy, both at the military level and obviously later at a political level. At the military level, at the moment, it is clear that there is an absolute need and an urgent need for a mechanism of stabilization. The program for training and equipping military groups, vetted groups, is itself finding it very difficult to define criteria about how you vet and who you vet, on what criteria you vet. And that is also an indication that if you do not say what the strategy is and what the end game is, it will be very, very difficult to identify individuals or groups whose loyalty can be guaranteed over a period of time. The adherence of these groups is dependent on the definition of a strategy that brings stabilization. It needs enforcement, it needs pacification first, fighting ISIS as well as the regime. And in that context, this idea of a stabilization force is one that extends the program of train and equip in ways that define clearly the enemy is ISIS as well as the regime. If we are looking at the root causes, we need to go in that direction. Otherwise, it is clear that there will be more spoilers for the US and the coalition strategy than there will be groups who will cooperate. And finally, I will say a word about the political solution. I think there is a lot that Syrians can do among themselves. They can definitely set the agenda and say clearly where they need outside support and international support. But they can also say how the sequencing of a solution can occur. There is definitely need in the beginning of the process for regional countries to halt their delivery of any aid, military support to the regime, as well as to the fighting groups against the regime. But there is also a need to withdraw some of these militias that have entered and are fighting directly on the side of the regime. The sequencing of a political solution is now something that Syrians can see clearly. The stabilization, again, is a key factor. So defining the outline of a political settlement, the framework of a political settlement, is one that brings immediately the military and security apparatus to be at the heart of a political process. And by that, I am referring to the loyalist army as well as the Free Syrian Army. The capacity to merge on agreed criteria that guarantee, again, the security of all Syrian communities is, in the minds of the responsible opposition in Syria, a priority. And that, I think, is understood. And for anyone who wants to hear what the opposition is saying, I think it is saying clearly that that is one absolute priority before we can make it possible for the political framework to be implementable and to be implemented. There is another dimension, and that is the dealing with the diversity issue. Is it a secular constitution that will make it? I believe Syria needs a political system that keeps away or keeps neutral from any religious affiliation. We are extremely alarmed at the fact that the Christian communities have become an international issue. The international community cannot manage the Christians of Syria, nor any of the minorities of Syria. It is for a political system to do so, and for the governance system to do so. Likewise, the Kurdish issue will be a test case for the success of a new political system. If it is functioning, the Kurds will want to be part of it. If it is not, they will want to drift with an agenda of their own. And therefore, the problem does not lie so much with what their aspirations are, as much as it depends on what kind of a functioning governance system is established. So that tells us it is about how the administrative central state versus local governance is defined, is definitely, after the military and security dimension, a key aspect or a priority to define in order to signal to all communities that they will have the right place within the political system. And finally, this is where, of course, comes the international community in terms of assistance. The Syrians are in need of everyday food at the moment, which, as you know, is being reduced rather than even maintained, while the number of needy Syrians is growing. The reconstruction process will be daunting. We know what a huge task that will be, but the preparation for that is something that is positive enough for Syrians to mobilize beyond their sectarian, beyond the sectarian divide. I think we have many indications that this is also in preparation if the international community is able to support it financially. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and there's so much on the agenda that we'll want to bring out. David. Excellent, thanks very much.
Well, talk of a comprehensive strategy has set me up very well, so thank you. And no general, and there's quite a few out there, can talk without quoting from Clausewitz or Sun Tzu, and I'm no different. It was Sun Tzu who said in 500 BC that strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is merely the noise before defeat. If I have a single theme over the next few minutes, it's that we've consistently fallen into Sun Tzu's trap. Lots of policy masquerading as strategy, and certainly lots of tactics, but few joined up long-term plans that successfully synthesize strategic ends, ways, and means, the essence of a strategy. Amongst other things, this has led to many false lessons about the nature of war, including that more conventional operational concepts, albeit updated to reflect the arrival of modern technology, are outmoded and unlikely to lead to strategic success. Well, I question this assumption. I'd also ask that you distinguish between conventional military operations, at their most impressive on the Blitzkrieg model, and enduring stabilization operations, including counterinsurgency. Joining the nexus between the two has been our problem, leading both to be tarnished. I should emphasize that I take as a given that no military operation should be launched unless it's well rooted in a political framework. Every officer is taught this from day one of attendance at Staff College, if only others understood this as well. So a few thoughts, some of which I think are pretty timeless. If states want to achieve strategic success, let alone a desired tactical outcome, those states have to be genuinely and full-bloodedly committed to their cause. The concept of discretionary war has no meaning to those fighting them at the low tactical level, or, importantly, to the millions of innocent people whose lives will be ruined by a failure to fight wars properly. From a humanitarian perspective, often the proclaimed basis for going to war in the first place, if that is the approach, then better let your more single-minded enemy win. In the British Armed Forces, we talk colloquially of clout don't dribble. It's a simple adage that rarely fails those who apply it, and I just hope the translator gets it right. Turning to some specifics from the last few years, Afghanistan is often unjustifiably and certainly prematurely described as something of a failure. In fact, in the context of this session, certainly, the first phase of the Afghan war, if you cast your minds back to it, was a stunning success, a model proxy operation. Local indigenous forces, supported by specialist capabilities from key allies, especially air and special forces, won that stunning victory, which was followed up, actually, by a rapidly deployed stabilization force. It was only then that a combination of naivety and a distracting focus on Iraq allowed the states concerned not to follow up their military success with the Marshall Plan scale of generosity and decisive early commitment in the non-military sphere that was required for enduring strategic success. It wasn't until about 2010 that the right formula was sort of reached, but by then the challenges were much greater. As an aside, incidentally, it's vital that we continue to support Afghanistan now in order to not to repeat there the errors of premature withdrawal being played out in Iraq today. Turning to Iraq, the operation of 2003 was arguably even more stunning a tactical campaign than that happened in Afghanistan 2 years earlier. But once again, it was marred at the strategic level by a failure to think through and apply some timeless lessons. Lessons that we should not forget that were applied almost to perfection only 50 years or so earlier at the end of World War II, when a combination of generosity of spirit and pragmatic accommodation, a proper understanding of the strategic purpose, and a focus on economic recovery and popular support through the gift of the Marshall Plan was synthesized almost to perfection. Marshall, by the way, and most of you will know this, was a soldier. Experience in Afghanistan and Iraq has, as a result of a failure to learn the right lessons, made Western political leaders in particular very reluctant to risk similar outcomes in fresh campaigns. It's persuaded some to come up with solutions that fall short of the resolute, decisive, and long-term commitment that is a timeless lesson of war. In particular, it involves a preference for local or regional forces to act as willing proxies for their own. Now, if Afghan-style proxy indigenous forces, a concept rediscovered tactically in Libya in 2011, are to be used, they require generous and concerted levels of support. Timid support will lead to a worse outcome, one that risks marginalizing the good and well-intentioned and encouraging the extremist. It is this, a failure to synthesize ways and means in a timely manner, that some would argue is playing out in Syria and in Iraq. And we must be careful not to add further confusion through the loose use of terminology. Daesh, for example, may use terrorist techniques, but they possess all the trappings of a conventional army. They hold ground, they maneuver, they have tanks, artillery, identifiable command and control, and logistic lines of supply. Their defeat requires a combination of largely conventional tactical solutions nested in a strategic campaign that includes a lot of politics. Drones and special forces will not achieve the required outcome. Recalling the hundreds of thousands of people whose lives are already ruined, and the many more whose lives may yet be ruined by a failure to resolve the Syrian and now Iraq crisis in a timely manner, nor will air power alone be sufficient to drive back and then defeat Daesh. It can help prevent their future expansion, and certainly has done, but to push back and defeat them will require ground forces that can maneuver decisively. But how long do we have? Solutions that talk about a generational timeline risk ceding the strategic initiative to one's enemy and would receive few marks in any staff college. Mass still matters in war, both in conventional operations and in any stabilization phase that follows. If indigenous forces are the solution, their success will require a massive training and support operation, not a few hundred trainers here and there. While the nature of war is timeless, the techniques required to fight one keep evolving. Even 10 years ago, only a few military groupies were really talking about hybrid war, more narrowly defined than it is today, cyber war, and more widely of strategic campaigns fought through the ether and social media in particular, designed to disrupt and defeat opponents, states usually from within. These are very demanding concepts, and the solutions take much intelligent thought, understanding, and generous resourcing. Thus far, states have proved themselves poor at this compared to smaller, agile, and tightly run non-state opponents. This is an area in which we've got to get much better, along with command and control, of which more finally in a moment, logistics, air, aviation, and other demanding specialist capabilities that advanced military nations within any coalition should be able to shoulder on behalf of their less technically advanced allies. Intelligent burden sharing in any coalition remains key, and in the context of what we're doing in this region, there's a long way to go, in my judgment. Unity of purpose and unity of command are prerequisites for any successful military operation. Discretionary wars too often lead to confused aims and incoherent command arrangements, the antithesis of what is needed. Here, the GCC, as many in the organisation I know aspire to, would set a fine example by creating for themselves a militarily efficient joint command so that they're properly able to face up to future challenges together, let alone current ones. And NATO in the Cold War would serve as a good basis for the evolution of such arrangements. My own experience of command in coalition operations led me to amend Bradley's observation at the end of World War II, in which he famously said that amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. I've been saying for a number of years that true professionals, first and foremost, talk command and control, then logistics, and then tactics. Without effective command and control, it doesn't actually matter how good one's equipment is, and there's some fantastic equipment in this region, or how well trained your people are and your units are. Your forces will not be effective when put under pressure, which you should expect them to be. Arguably, this is what caused the Iraqi army's problems last summer. It is poorly understood by too many people, especially political leaders, who are not prepared to make the political compromises needed to ensure effective military operations. So finally, in summary, and returning to Sun Tzu, I see a lot of tactics and too little reliable strategy. A strategy that fails to synthesize ends, ways, and means within a strategically sound period of time is no strategy, but ultimately could be dangerous self-deception that could result in many more people's lives being ruined and vital strategic goals being missed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David, thank you for that brilliant exposition of strategy. Jamal Khashoggi.
Thank you, Jan. I'm so tempted to use this line, even though I'm sure somebody have used it before me. 10 years ago, when the Manama dialogue started, it started with IISS, and now it is ISIS all over. And it is not wrong to say that, because ISIS deserves that, particularly for us, the Arabs. The danger of ISIS is real, and we need to spend much time understanding ISIS and understanding its root causes, because if we do not do that, 10 years later, many of us will be living in an ISIS country, in an ISIS territory somehow or another. Because ISIS is not an army, as Mr. Fajal explained a while ago. It's an idea that feeds in our failures. The Iraqi finance minister, Mr. Hoshyar Zipari, said that yesterday in the conference, that he said, we were afraid of a failed state. Now I'm afraid of a failed region. We see the failed region in many parts of the Arab world today. Why we fail to see the tree of ISIS growing around us for the last 10 years? Because there are ISIS elements in all of us in the Arab world. In most Arab states, with the absence of the following: rule of law, democracy, human rights values, and interest in a better life for all. The absence of all of that is similar to what ISIS stands for. So we share those elements with ISIS, so ISIS should not be a surprise to us. We share some of ISIS ideas. Up to 2011, we only were concerned with the security matters around the issue of Iran, Iraq, and whatever branch from both, like the nuclear issue, Iran's intervention in the region, war in Iraq, Al-Qaeda there, Iraq after American withdrawal. All those issues were discussed repeatedly in the various rounds of IISS meetings here in Manama. Somehow, with our failures in most of the previous issues, the tree of ISIS was growing in Iraq and later in Syria and in other parts of the Arab world, and it continued to branch out. Yes, it is a radical form of Islam. We all agree on that. Some of us, many, say it's not Islam. No, it is a radical form of Islam. But every society has a radical movement or had a radical nuclear ideas, whether it is around religion or around race. But those movements, they always stay small, insignificant, under the limitations and the rule of the governing law in those countries. Sometimes they make it and they go even to the parliament, but they stay unattractive. But why our radical thought or our radical movement grow out of control? That is something for us to discuss. I'm sure the ideas of Salafi jihadists, the narrow understanding of Islam, going to continue with us. Many of us are going to carry on those ideas with them. But why should those ideas be attractive, be an alternative to our future? That's what we did not discuss in ISIS in IISS conference in the last 10 years. The Arab world was and is still decaying. Bad governance, failed educations, unfair distribution of wealth, social injustice, which lead for our land to be a fertile land for radical ideas. In early 2011, history finally smiled upon the Arab states. When the wave of democracy that hit Greece, Spain, Portugal in 1970s, Eastern Europe in the late 80s, and Latin America, when that wave of democracy reached us, Arab youth raising their non-radical voices. There were no flag of ISIS, no flag of Al-Qaeda in Tahrir Square of Egypt or elsewhere. They were calling for freedom, for justice, equality, and happy life. Some countries in the Arab world, they were smart enough to accommodate those voices, like this country, Bahrain, Jordan, Oman, and they succeeded, and Morocco in particular. They succeeded in withstanding the waves. However, others resisted this wave. But with their resistance, they failed to sustain the old system that delusionally they thought it was stability. It wasn't stability. I like a term of a friend who called it the stability of the graves, the stability of fear. They failed to maintain that old system, but in the same time did not allow a new Arab order based on true democratic values to prevail, which resulted in a civil war and chaos. Because the choice was either to let a new system emerge, but since we did not allow it to emerge, chaos as we see it today in Syria or in Libya and in Iraq too. This chaos is another branch of ISIS tree, which deepened and reached its peak last summer when it took over the second largest city in Iraq, Mosul. Taking over Mosul is not the most painful thing. It is a serious defeat for an Arab idea, but it's not the most painful thing. The most painful thing that the people of Mosul accepted ISIS. That is a fact that needs studying, needs looking at, that people chose ISIS as their future rather than the dreams they had for modernity in previous time. And I'm sure if the people of Mosul today were given the choice to return to the control of the government of Baghdad or stay under ISIS, maybe they will choose ISIS. That is something we need to discuss. When radical ideas like ISIS become attractive to the future of the Arab world. Thank you very much.
Jamal, thank you very much. Also, a fourth in a row brilliant presentation that has brought a lot of important issues to the table. Mark reminded us of 164 centrifuges in 2004 and many thousands now. Basma Kudmani did tell us that if moderate forces in Syria are assured that there is an end game for Syria, they might be willing for a time to serve as the ground forces for the coalition's air forces. But that promise has to be real and credible. David Richards, in his strategic statement, also reminded us that while Daesh uses terrorist methods, they have conventional capabilities, and raised the question whether, as it were, asymmetric tactics against Daesh are proper, and that maybe we should have a symmetric campaign against Daesh and deal with a power that has conventional forces with conventional riposte. And the same issue of governance that Basma Kudmani raised was also powerfully raised by Jamal Khashoggi. We have a number of people on the list. I'm going to take 6 or 7. I'm interested as much in crisp questions as in crisp comments, so invite you to say what sees you here. Dr. Florence Gove first, please.
When I contemplated the topic of the session, Reflections on 10 Years of Change, first I think about what has not changed in the last 10 years, and that's protracted instability. When I started working on this region, there's been interstate war, intrastate war, conflict, instability has been endemic all along. And as a political scientist or international relations theorist, we believe that the region is the victim of its latecomer status in the international system, which makes it vulnerable to foreign interference, but also due to the fact that it has so many middle powers which create a balance of weakness rather than a balance of power, meaning that states can actually interfere with each other rather than create stability, a hegemon that could create stability. But what is new and what has changed is that 2011 began as a domestic challenge, but it's become a regional problem. What's new is the Gulf moment. And Gulf states have, in a way, created a villa in the jungle, an island of stability, which maybe allows them, and that would be my question, to seize the situation. And so my question to the panel would be, how can the Gulf states seize the moment to be a stability producer rather than a security consumer, as it's been in the past, and drive the region, fortunately or hopefully, to a more stable next decade? Thank you.
Florence, thank you very much. I think a lot of people took down your villa in the jungle phrase. Dr. Al-Badr Al-Shatri.
Thank you very much, John. I just want to, I'm a little bit concerned about playing fast and loose with historical facts. in the case of the rise of ethnic exclusivist movement to power. I mean, obviously the European experience with the Nazis and the fascists, or whether the Afrikaner regime, the exclusionist, racialist regime in South Africa, or the segregationist in southern United States. And this also will include the Jewish exclusivist state of Israel, supported, cuddled, and encouraged and abetted by Western powers. So it's not just, ISL is not an Arab and Muslim phenomena exclusively. We have plenty of Western history where those movements rose to power. We're not minority, rose to power and dominated. So just to make the historical facts straight. But my question is not about this. Is to Ms. Kudmani regarding good governance. Now, obviously, our experience with the Arab Spring, to put it generously, was not good. The outcome we were hoping for of equality, democracy, and what have you, was not attained. So my question is, could it be a regionally conceived, a regional concept, a local concept of good governance that is based on Islamic Arab conception of rule of law, ombudsman, equality before the law, accountability, could be an alternative to liberal Western style, Westminster style government? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very important question. Dr. Ayman Safadi, former Deputy Prime Minister of Jordan.
Thank you, John. I think a lot of us, when they look at the outcome of the last 10 years, some of us seem surprised, which we should not. I think last 10 years have been a failure, but ultimately I think what we've seen in the last few years is the harvest of a century of failure in the Arab world to establish functioning nation states, for all the reasons that Jamal Khashoggi sort of mentioned, which I totally agree with, and other reasons. Question is, looking forward, are we in any position to fix what has happened? And judging by what we're seeing, I think the answer is no. I think if we think we're in a bad situation now, I think things are going to get much, much worse. Why I say that? Because despite all the rhetoric, we're not really seeing any strategic, long-term sort of action to address the root cause of the problems and set the region on a path towards a solution. Look at Syria, for instance. The war on ISIS now, we're talking about 60 nations as being part of the coalition. In reality, this is not the case. We're fighting ISIS in Iraq for reasons that have to do with a Western understanding of what the nature of the problem is, but we're not addressing the key issue, which is Syria. The fact is, even if you destroy ISIS in Iraq, it's going to go back to Syria, penetrate into the chaos that Syria has become, regroup, feed on the despair, feed on the frustration, and then spread into the rest of the region. And if we look at the voice of Ms. Qadamani, for instance, among the early voices of the Syrian revolutions, where are they now? They're nowhere to be heard. None of the representatives of the country that have spoken in the last 2 days, for instance, here, have indicated any long-term plan that could offer the promise of a solution. It's become, for a lot of those countries, it's a luxury. Part of it is because the strategy has been designed, conceptualized in the West with very little regards to the understanding of the problem of the region, partly because of the complacency of the Arab world as well. We've seen the problem emerging for years. We've seen Syria deteriorate from a revolution for democracy and freedom, from an oppressive regime into a sectarian war, a civil war, a battlefield for a regional war, and very little is being done about it. So I think, to sum up, I think the 10 years coming are going to be much, much worse because we're dealing with the symptoms of the problem. We're not looking at the root cause of the problem. We're not addressing the main issue of why terrorism is spreading now, which is Syria, because it's not convenient for the countries that are in charge now to do so. And I'll just throw one example, and probably Ms. Qadamani could address that, is that what are we doing about Syrian refugees now? All the talk now is about probably providing daily subsistence, food, water. But in reality, in Jordan, for instance, there are about 1.4 million people, of whom 600,000 are registered as refugees. Among these, at least, there are 100 children below the age of 10. What are those going to be 10 years from now if they are not provided with schools, with education, with hope? We're looking at a ready army for what is worse than ISIS to come and recruit. Thank you.
Iman, thank you very much. I might call now on Toby Dodge and whatever he had planned to say, if we might also react to Jamal Khashoggi's rather strong statement that the tragedy in Mosul was not just that ISIL got to Mosul, but that the population of Mosul largely accepted it. Toby.
Yes, thank you. The population of Mosul is about 1.8 million, and I think to say that even a small minority of that population accepted Daesh's seizure of the city, I'd need to see a lot more information, because that's counter to my analysis and nearly all the analysis and the reports from the city that I've seen. I think it would be much more sustainable to argue that the generalized revolt that we saw spread across the northwest of Iraq from probably the removal of al-Asawi, the finance minister, in 2012 through 2013 and 14, it created the arena within which 5 or 6 insurgent groups, one of which was the Islamic State, managed to seize large amounts of territory. I think that would be a more sustainable point. My question was actually to Lord Richards. And if I may do the damage of paraphrasing your excellent talk, it was the military had stunning successes, but they were let down by the lack of a political strategy. So if the men and women in uniform are so good, how do we get better politicians to give them political strategies? I'd appreciate a detailed answer to that. And secondly, how do we impose a political strategy, or how do we work through a political strategy when you're deploying proxy forces? That seems to me, and as evidenced by Afghanistan, to be a contradiction in terms.
Thanks very much. We'll come back to that. Matthew Harris.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Lord Richards to reflect on what we heard yesterday, which was a major new agreement between the UK and Bahrain. A foreign secretary talking about the UK being back in business east of Suez. The defence secretary hammering home the British will to fight. So the UK's military ambitions, especially in the Middle East, are not shrinking. But resources have shrunk, and they may well shrink more, if not in real terms, then at least in terms of percentage of GDP. So my question is the UK going to be spending enough on defence to match its ambitions? If not, which is it that needs to change? Is it the spending or the ambitions? And you told us Sun Tzu's thoughts on strategy without tactics. What about strategy without money?
Michael Brown.
John, thanks very much. When I look at the regional security changes that have taken place over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of focus on problems. I'd like to highlight one contribution to solutions, and that is this Manama dialogue. And since it would be immodest for you to brag about it, let me take my 2 minutes and do that for you. This is not just a superb conference. I really see this as the Institute using its convening power to engage in a very important network building, relationship building, and capacity building exercise, and the cumulative effect of that over 10 years, I think, is truly important. You're using soft power to generate, you're using soft power on the Institute's part to generate soft power for the region and the world more generally. It's certainly not sufficient to solve all of our problems, but I believe it's necessary and important. Looking forward to the future, how to enhance this capacity building effort, I'd suggest that we should all be guided by UN Security Council Resolution 1325. And the year 2015 will be marking the 15th anniversary of 1325. It's binding on UN member states, including all of those represented in this room. And I know of at least one NATO defense minister who was completely clueless when asked about 1325, and indeed it's possible some people are even now writing down these numbers for the first time. It's the UN Resolution on Women, Peace, and Security, which talks about the protection of women and girls in conflict situation, but also talks about the important role that women must play in conflict prevention, and conflict resolution exercises, and that's especially important in the context of one of the main items of discussion over these past few days, the problem of combating violent extremism. In the U.S., 57% of college students are women. 67% of college graduates are women. Women are becoming empowered in the 21st century, and that's a very good thing. So as we all think about capacity building exercises for the next 10 years, and as we think about developing multi-generational solutions to multi-generational problems, it's important for us to put this first and foremost in our thinking, not just in our classrooms and conferences, but in our countries and the world in general. And so let me conclude, John, by saying keep up the great work, and also, if I may, I hope that you and your colleagues will keep up your very important work. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much. Shifting gears, at the very beginning of this session, Mark Fitzpatrick talked about discussions with Hassan Rouhani when he was National Security Advisor. His deputy at the time, from whom you've heard a lot this weekend, is Syed Hussein Mousavian, and I give you the floor now. Syed Hussein. Right.
Thank you very much, John. Mark, thank you. It was really a very short, good history, but at the end you were suspicious why Iran is not ready to continue buy fuel from Russia. First of all, Mark, Iranians, they have never said that we don't trust Russia. They say, due to 30 years of the West preventing Iran from getting fuel from international market, we need to have some part of self-sufficiency as guarantee for our future. You remember, Mark, France declined to give fuel to Iran early 1980s when Iran didn't have enrichment and didn't want to have enrichment. Iran paid the U.S. for fuel rod to for research reactor to Iraq for Tehran research reactor. The U.S. did not give Iran the fuel rod and did not pay Iranian money back. That's why this history pushed Iran to go for self-sufficiency. 80s, America told Iran, you cannot have civilian nuclear power plant. When Iran mastered enrichment, the US said, oh, look, now you can have a power plant, but you cannot have enrichment. When Iran went to master 20,000 centrifuges, then said, look, you can have enrichment, but buy from Russia. This notion is really problematic for Iranians, and you should keep in mind, Mark, that they have invested billions and they have paid the cost of hundreds of billions of dollars of sanctions. Now they have a facility with hundreds or some thousands of engineers, scientists, they are working. If they want to continue to buy 15, 20 years from Russia, then they have to close Natanz. That's why they say for the new contracts, we are ready to buy from international market. What we have already invested and we have paid the cost, and we have it after 2021, we should be able to provide fuel for Bushehr. Jamal, I want to thank you. It was really excellent analysis on ISIS. I want to propose Iran, Saudi Arabia, they have many differences. Yesterday, the State Minister of Saudi Arabia said, our policy is first trust, then dialogue. If there is a trust, you don't need dialogue. The dialogue is to create trust. Therefore, the minister strategy really means no dialogue, because if you want everything, all trust, transparency before dialogue, then you won't need dialogue. I think the Muslim powers, like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, like Iraq, like Iran, they can begin to establish a collective regional Islamic package and measure to fight extremism in general. Whether we have Shia extremism or Sunni extremism, whether this is Daesh or I don't know, whatever it is. This would create a first step trust between the regional powers. I really don't support the US interfering in Muslim countries fighting the Muslim terrorists or those who call themselves Muslim, because the US is not popular in Arab world, in the image of US is not good. This would really give more fuel to the crisis, because they would feel this is America, this is Zionism, invading Afghanistan, invading Iraq, and they would be able to recruit more. If we have Muslim countries' forces collectively cooperate to fight these people who are claiming they are Muslim, and we would need the US, we would need P5+1 support at the United Nations as a support, not military interference.
Thank you very much. We'll just take two more, and then we'll give each of the panelists 3 minutes to wrap up. Charles Lister, please.
Thank you very much. My question is quite Syria-focused to Mrs. Kudmani. Thank you for your presentation. There's been a lot of talk over the last 48 hours about the importance of using local actors and ground-up movements towards solving problems and conflicts in this region, and rightly so. And you used the term responsible opposition as being the key actor, or a key actor in solving the Syrian crisis. I wonder, first of all, how you would define the responsible opposition. And in relation to that, the one big lesson learned, I think, over the last 3 or 4 years has been that the official Syrian opposition in Turkey has been increasingly minimally representative of facts on the ground. And it is not liked on the ground by a vast majority of the people fighting. And so, whether we like it or not, over time, Syrian armed groups with more of an Islamic frame of reference have come to dominate dynamics on the ground. So I wonder, the second question would be whether you agree that structures or mechanisms should be put into place by the international community, or, as you said, by Syrians themselves, to incorporate or to better incorporate these kind of actors into talking about negotiating a political solution in the future.
Dr. Pierre Noël.
Thank you, John. Mark, you gave a brilliant summary of the past 10 years. If I were to summarize your summary, I would say that Iran wants to acquire nuclear weapon capability, and a group of mostly Western nations want to prevent it from doing so. I don't really see where the ground for an agreement is. So if you're right in your summary and in your analysis of the past 10 years, there will not be an agreement. So my question to you is, do you think that the nations that are trying to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapon capability will go to war with Iran to destroy this capability? Or will they accommodate, and if they do so, what are the consequences for regional security? Or will they accommodate a nuclear-capable Iran, with what consequences for regional security?
Finally, and very briefly, Dan Allen.
Thank you, John. My question to Lord Richards follows a similar theme to that of my colleagues, and I've been signaled it must be very short. But you warned us not to be sucked into the delusion of discretionary wars, and you made a very eloquent point that there's no such thing for the soldiers fighting them. But the example you gave, World War II, was a total war in which our societies were completely mobilized. And so my question, and maybe I'm taking you too literally or simple-mindedly, but how do Western powers, especially the United States, play the global security role expected of them if you believe that military action requires the kind of total commitment of societies that actually I don't think societies are prepared to undertake?
Thank you very much. Well, I will give about 3 minutes to each participant to react to what was most compelling for them, not to ignore questions, but to pick up the most important points for them. So I think I'll move from left to right. So I'll ask Jamal Khashoggi first, then David Richards, then Basma, and then Mark Fitzpatrick. Jamal.
All right. I'll start from the comment of my friend Hussein Mousoufian, who always wants and hope for a Saudi-Iranian rapprochement. And I commend that, I agree with that. But I'm very optimistic about it. I'm very pessimistic about it. I don't think it will work for three issues. Number one, and those three issues are all related. Number one, Iran's position in Syria. And ISIS is an Arab failure. It is not an Iranian failure. It is our failure, and we must handle it ourselves. And number three, it is a Sunni problem. And if Iran's get into it, it will make it more complicated. Iran has an issue of trust, not because of those three issues, not only with Saudi Arabia, but even with the Syrian opposition. I'm sure the Syrian opposition will not welcome an Iran initiative or will not trust an Iran initiative because they saw what Iran did in Syria. But meanwhile, Iran and Saudi Arabia are already at war with ISIS. They did not ask each other permission. I mean, Iran is working against ISIS in Iraq, and Saudi Arabia is working against ISIS in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. And also there is something positive about Iran and Saudi Arabia. They both are cooperating in freezing, and this Lebanon example could be used elsewhere. Saudi Arabia and Iran, they work together, maybe indirectly, maybe without talking to each other, into freezing the situation in Lebanon, not to fix it, but just to freeze it as it is till the Syrian conflict is over. Then it will be brought out from the freezer, and they will elect a president probably 10 years later. But meanwhile, it is frozen there. So Saudi Arabia can work together, but they cannot really remove the issue of trust. On my comment about the Mosul and the people of the Mosul, what have we given, or what have Iraq and the international community given the Sunni community of the Mosul to take the risk of rising against the brutal ISIS? We must have noticed 6 months after the Mosul occupation, or conquering, depending where you stand, the people of Mosul are indifferent. I mean, they did not even attempt, there was not a single attempt to rise against ISIS. Why is that? Because Baghdad did not give any initiative or a promise to the people of Mosul, the Arab Sunnis, that if you come back to our fold, you are going to have this or that. This hasn't happened yet. So until that happened, I think any talk about incorporating the Sunni Arabs in the fight, the Sunni Iraqi Arabs in the fight against ISIS is fruitless. And lastly, about the role of the Gulf states, I think we lost the role. We lost a big opportunity in regards to Arab Spring. When Arab Spring erupted, the Gulf states were stable. They could have played the role of a big brother, where we become inclusive, where we bring diverse parties in troubled countries together. We made the mistake of taking sides. The result of that is more chaos, and we lost that position. And I wish my country, I think Saudi Arabia should have been the big brother that play a role because of its Arab and strong Islamic position, but unfortunately we did not. Libya is the best example to illustrate my point. Rather than the Arabs or the Saudis going to Libya and bringing all the Libyans together in a table and ask them to discuss a peaceful arrangement for their future, unfortunately, we let others take sides. The Qataris and the Emiratis are fighting in Libya. Neither won, and the result is a civil war in Libya. Thank you.
Can I just ask you before we move to David Richards, we've all noticed that Iran is keen on fighting ISIL in Iraq. Will it be as keen in fighting ISIL in Syria, in your view?
I'm sure the Iranians are fighting ISIL in Syria. They are already involved. They are fighting along with Bashar, and Bashar is at war with ISIL. So They don't really asking for a permission to do that, and they take pride. As our Canadian friend said yesterday, Mr. Qasim Soleimani is taking selfies everywhere. We haven't seen a selfie of him in a Raqqa, but I'm sure if he has the opportunity, he would do that.
David Richards.
Well, I've got four, I think, the Jordanian ex-ministers. I think you've put your finger on a really important point, which I hope I brought out in my prepared talk, is about time. I personally, I suppose I've come off the fence anyway, do not agree with the rather sort of incremental approach that appears to be the basis of the strategy that we're taking collectively towards Daesh. I think it seeds the strategic initiative, as I said. I'm very conscious, and I'm a soldier, of millions whose lives are being ruined and who could yet have their lives ruined, economies that could be shattered that are not necessarily very strong, and so on and so forth. So for my take, I would be getting on with it, and I think Syria has to be absolutely integral to the military strategy that we come up with. And I emphasize that the military strategy is no strategy if it's not nested within an overall grand strategy for the region, if that's helpful. So time is key. I don't think we've got as long as some think. Toby, thanks for that. Well, in the NATO era, certainly in Britain, I think it was widespread throughout NATO countries. Political leaders regularly exercised. They always ended at the point and someone had to decide whether to press a button that would launch nuclear war. And in that era, from my memory, and obviously I was quite a junior officer, but just caught the tail end of it, people like Margaret Thatcher had a pretty good understanding of general military issues because she engaged. That hasn't happened, certainly in Britain, for a long time. We do little bits of it occasionally, but I think we need to sort of perhaps have another look at some mechanism that allows them to develop a better understanding of the military. The challenge function is not well established or properly supported in most countries. In a good company, you should have people who challenge by design, the red team we might call it in the military, the hierarchy, the chief executive. That's not popular in government, in my experience. Read my book. What we really want are statesmen, not politicians. And a lot of politicians have the makings of being statesmen, but many might have not yet quite got there. Matthew, yeah, dodgy one. I'm very much with your question. Where are you? I think at some point, if ambition can no longer be met, then you have to refine your ambition. I would emphasize that Britain, even with the cuts that we have all experienced in the last few years, is still a very big player militarily. And if Future Force 2020, which was the basis of is still the basis of what Great Britain's armed forces will look like, comes to half fruition, it's something to be quite proud of. If there are further cuts, and I know you know the rumours like I do, then I think Great Britain may well have to address its ambitions. But it doesn't mean that our commitment here needs to be refined. It might be that we have to role or regional specialise, for example. I think the Royal Navy, with 2 fleet carriers and some very impressive vessels, will be at the core of whatever we do here, along with the Royal Air Force. The Army may be, in this respect, have to play a slightly lesser role, although a lot of the British Army now are focusing, as Nick Horton said earlier in our breakout session, on training and support, and that's very important too. So I'm with you in theory. I don't think we're there yet, but something we need to have to be brave enough to address. And then finally, quickly, Dana Allen, I think you did slightly overinterpret it, but in fact you did, but I don't mind that at all, because it sort of gets the debate going. I think Afghanistan at one stage was being done full-bloodedly, and the results started to be self-evident. Towards the end of the Iraq campaign, actually was being done very well with the right number of forces, and come 2010, things looked a lot better than they clearly have become today. So I don't think it's impossible with allies. Don't forget, we're not talking about a single nation, even the United States, shouldering the burden alone. It's with allies, and we're all here in the same place. You can still do it properly, which is all I'm really suggesting.
David, thank you very much. Basma.
I'll try to be brief, but the questions require a long answer. Is there an Islam-based, a democratic system based on Islamic values? The answer is absolutely yes. But there are, of course, different conditions to that. And if we are to look at a Christian-based, if that's how we call Western systems, then let's look at that and see where religion has been brought in and where it has been left out because it disrupted equality, equal citizenship, and democratic governance. The question of Mr. Minister from Jordan, the moderates exist. The problem is there space in which they can move? I think what we saw is when the Geneva conference was called, it was a short period of time, unfortunately, but that is the moment where they emerge again. The media suddenly gets interested in them again. For the moment, there is no place for them in the media because it's not interesting. They prefer much more to focus on ISIS. It excites the public opinion much more than talking to boring, moderate, Syrian responsible opposition figures. But let me say this. There has been no route that was open for the opposition, the responsible opposition, to actually develop its strategy. Neither political, in terms of diplomatic negotiations, nor, for example, through the justice-seeking strategy, which is to go to the ICC. And there are huge files to put forward at the ICC. Instead, there was only this non-strategy for a military confrontation. So I think this is where the responsible opposition is paying the price. Does it have control on the groups on the ground? The answer is not. The reality is the groups on the ground have received outside support. Unfortunately, this has not been channeled through the opposition structure of the military structure of the opposition. Now, that leaves us in a situation where we need to talk to those who have provided the financial support because they are the ones who can close the tap, basically, and ask these groups to behave in a certain way. Now, I have no illusions about this possibility. I think we will continue to have chaotic, uncontrolled distribution of funds for some time. And groups on the ground have a lot of capacity to continue, perhaps without support. The one player who can discipline all the actors in the region is only the US, unfortunately, at this stage. It is through a coherent strategy from the US that we can expect and hope to have the proper channeling of funds to serve one strategy. The US has had no strategy for Syria. If it suddenly decides to do so, or finally decides to do so, I think it is in a position to do it on its own terms. This is the strategy, and this is where the countries of the region will have to get into a process. Otherwise, I fear we will continue to be victims of a regional rivalries and competition. Finally, if one is to talk about refugees, and Jordan is one of the countries that bears a huge burden of the refugees, if we do not have a strategy other than containment and fighting ISIS, I fear that we are transforming very profoundly the regional setting, including regional borders, including allegiance of different groups within each society. And this is an endless process that will definitely not stop at the borders of Jordan and Turkey. I think it will go much further. It will come to this region. It will be a dimension that, it is a dimension that all countries of the region need to think of in terms of their own proper national security. And that, I fear, has not been, the problem with the Syrian issue is that it has been underestimated in its gravity, in its seriousness, in its capacity to expand and to poison countries across the region way beyond the immediate neighbors of Syria.
Basma, thank you. Mark.
To answer, first of all, the question posed by Pierre Noël, who summarized very well the intractability of the issue. Yes, I'm pessimistic that there's any ground for agreement on the Iranian nuclear issue. If there is a ground for agreement, though, it's probably to be found in playing with the element of time. I think it's probably the case that President Rouhani is willing to delay acquisition of the capabilities to which they aspire fully. And that delay could, in the meantime, bring about a different situation. So the time element. Will the nations that are seeking to prevent the capability go to war over it? Ultimately, if Iran gets too close to having a nuclear weapon, or if they actually make the dash to get a nuclear weapon, I think nations that are concerned about it will take all necessary steps to prevent them, as President Obama had said. But I don't think it'll get there, because I think deterrence works in this case. Iran knows that if it gets that close to a weapon, that there will be military action, or at least they have to assume that there will be, and so I think they will stop short of it. The other question, I get nervous sometimes when Hossein Mousavian poses questions to me, because he knows these issues so well. But this time I think I have good answers to his insistence that Iran needs self-sufficiency in uranium enrichment. In fact, I have 4 good answers. The first is that Iran can't be self-sufficient in its energy program anyway, because they don't have sufficient uranium ore for the reactor program that they are planning. They have to rely on foreign providers of the ore. So they can't be self-sufficient. Secondly, it makes no sense for Iran to say that for the next 8 reactors, they're willing to rely on Russia and they don't worry about the provision of fuel. But they do worry about it for this first reactor, and therefore they have to provide the fuel. If they're worried about it for the first, they have to be worried about it for the next 8, and they would need a massive expansion of their enrichment program. It doesn't make any sense. Thirdly, if Iran really is concerned that the international community will prevent the provision of fuel for the reactors, there probably are better ways to address that concern than foregoing 100 billion opportunity costs in the form of sanctions and all the other costs of the program. They could, for example, avail themselves of the various forms of security, of fuel guarantees that various countries have put forward in connection with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Or Iran could buy several years' worth of fuel and stockpile it in case they run into that problem. But that's not Iran's real reason. There are other reasons for wanting this enrichment program. And the fourth thing is the argument seems to be that Iran has invested so much money and endured so many costs that they have to keep doing this. It's the argument of sunk costs. We did a stupid thing, so we have to keep doing a stupid thing in order to... Economists in the room know that sunk costs don't make any sense economically. My plea to Iran would be, stop doing a stupid thing.
Mark, thank you very much. First, could I invite all of you to thank our 4 panelists for a really strategic set of presentations that's animated a really strong debate. And in 2 minutes, I'll close this 10th Manama dialogue, but I just want to say the following. First, that we've enjoyed these first 10 years of the Manama Dialogue, and the IISS has also learnt its lessons about what works best in the Manama Dialogue and what we need to do better. And one of the things that we're very much committed to is ensuring that there's a fully inclusive set of states represented at the Manama Dialogue, that there are ministers from all 30 countries here, that there are a strong civil, military, and civil society component. But as this very last session will have demonstrated, we're also exceptionally keen to do better in making certain that the excellent intellectual voices and opinion formers of the region become a stronger feature of the dialogue, but also of the expanded work that the International Institute for Strategic Studies intends to do from its base here in the Kingdom of Bahrain. So starting in 2015, we will be reaching out to as many people as we can in the expert and analytical community, as well as to the governments, to ensure that we are bringing the strongest voices of the region to our own work and finding a vehicle to have those incorporated into the mainstream of international and global debate on Middle East issues. So that's a pledge that we make very firmly and that we hope to complete this coming year. Second, we want to build a strong strategy, to use David Richards' appropriately favorite word, to ensure strong underpinnings for the Manama Dialogue in the decade to come, building on what we've done in this first decade. And we will step up our efforts in 2015 to have early contact with experts, analysts, and the governments to ensure the 2015 Manama Dialogue is the strongest ever. And one thing that we will look carefully at is the dates of the Manama Dialogue, perhaps bringing them forward a few weeks' time to make certain that there's no risk that they abut too closely the GCC Heads of State Summit meeting or other important events on the international calendar, but stabilize those dates in a way in which we can ensure that people can plan ahead well for them. The third thing I would like to say is to thank very warmly the Kingdom of Bahrain, all the agencies of the government of the Kingdom of Bahrain, in particular the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for their support to the Manama Dialogue process and for their hard work here. And finally, if you'll permit me, I cannot list all their names, but I hope that you will join me in thanking the exceptionally hard workers of the IISS, here in Manama, in Washington, in Singapore, in India, in London, all of those who have gathered here to make the logistic arrangements here as smooth as they possibly can. I wish you all a very safe trip home. I want to thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to hearing from you about what we can do better, to seeing you all in Manama 2015. But please thank the IISS staff, the Kingdom of Bahrain, and yourselves for a very successful 10th Manama Dialogue.